Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about a brand new report that has just been released by the Kiel Institute, one of Europe's leading economic research organisations. Now, over the last 4 years, we've seen hundreds of reports about the Russian economy. We've seen predictions of collapse, we've seen predictions of recovery, analysts arguing that sanctions are working, and others arguing that sanctions have completely failed. And throughout all of that, there's been one question that economists have been trying to answer. How exactly is Russia paying for the war in Ukraine? Because despite all of the sanctions, losing most of its European energy market, export controls being applied, despite financial restrictions and everything else that's happened since February 2022, Russia has continued to fund an enormous military operation whilst also keeping its economy alive. And according to this new report, we've all been looking in the wrong place because whilst everyone has been focusing on government budgets and oil revenues, the real story has been hidden inside Russian companies, Russian banks, and what the authors describe as a massive expansion of off-balance sheet war financing. And the numbers are extraordinary. This report is entitled Endgame, the State of the Russian Economy. Now that's a bold title. Economists don't usually use language like that, so what exactly do they mean? Well, interestingly, they're not predicting an economic collapse. They're not saying Russia's about to go bankrupt or that the war will end suddenly because Russia's run out of money. What they're saying is that Russia's economy is gradually running out of options. And that's a very different argument. But before we get into the details of all of this, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button? It really does help me with the algorithm, also puts a smile on my face. And if you give me a thumbs up for this video, that would be great too. And maybe even hype it, if you know what hype is. If you see the hype symbol, give it a press and it will boost this video. Now, into the details of all of this. One of the most interesting findings in this report relates to the way that Russia has actually financed the war. Most people assume that wars are funded through government spending. Governments borrow money, run deficits, and pay for military operations directly through the state budget. Whilst that is certainly happening in Russia, the report argues that the government deficit only tells a small part of the story. Since the start of the invasion, Russia's cumulative government deficit has reached around 18 trillion rubles. That's obviously a large amount of money. However, according to this report, Russian companies have taken on more than 37 trillion rubles of additional debt over the same period. In other words, the increase in corporate borrowing has been more than double the government's accumulated deficit. And that tells us something very important. Russia hasn't simply been financing this war through the state, it's been financing it through the entire banking system. The report shows that lending to sectors linked to military production has been growing around 2.5 times faster than lending to the civilian economy. So whilst everyone has been watching government spending, Russian banks have quietly been pumping enormous amounts of money into defence manufacturers, electronics companies, transport businesses and other sectors supporting the war effort. And this is where the report gets really interesting because the authors argue that this model is now creating significant stress within the banking sector itself. For the first few years of the war, this strategy worked reasonably well. The government increased military spending, banks increased their lending, factories expanded production, employment increased, GDP growth remained positive, and many observers concluded that the sanctions simply weren't working. But the report argues that what was actually happening was that Russia was effectively bringing future growth forward. The country wasn't creating a permanently stronger economy, it was consuming financial resources at an accelerated rate. And now the consequences are beginning to emerge. Around 11% of corporate loans are now classified as problematic. 5 major banks have reportedly fallen below minimum capital requirements. Overdue corporate debt has surged around 8 trillion rubles, and businesses are increasingly struggling under the weight of high borrowing costs. Now, we've talked a lot on this channel about Russian interest rates. The Russian central bank has spent much of the last 2 years desperately trying to contain inflation, and at one point interest rates rose to 21%, which is an incredibly high figure. If you imagine trying to run a business with borrowing costs above 20%, it would be very difficult to take on any debt at all. Now imagine trying to invest in machinery, expand production, trying to service existing debt. All of that becomes a lot more expensive and much more difficult and takes away a lot of cash flow. And according to the report, even though rates have started to come down, they are still expected to remain extremely high throughout the rest of this year. That means many businesses are now facing rising debt burdens at the same time as economic growth is slowing. And slowing growth is another major theme running throughout this report. For much of the war, Russia benefited from a huge increase in military spending. Factories received orders, workers were hired, production increased, and headline GDP growth remained relatively strong. But the report argues that Russia is now reaching the limit of what economists call capacity constraints. Put simply, the economy is running out of spare resources. Labour shortages have become severe. Hundreds of thousands of working-age men have either been mobilised, joined the military voluntarily, left the country, or moved into defence-related industries. As a result, many civilian sectors are struggling to recruit workers. Official unemployment has fallen to around 2%, which at first glance seems fantastic, but most politicians would love an unemployment that low in other countries. But when unemployment becomes extremely low, it can actually create serious problems. Companies compete aggressively for workers, wages rise rapidly, labour becomes scarce, and inflationary pressures increase. The report argues that Russia has now reached a point where additional government spending increasingly generates inflation rather than additional output, and that's a crucial distinction, because for the first 3 years of the war, more spending generally meant more production. Now, more spending increasingly means higher prices, and that is a much less sustainable situation. The next major issue highlighted in the report relates to Russia's financial reserves. At the start of the war, Russia had substantial buffers available through its National Wealth Fund. This was effectively the country's emergency savings account, built up during years of strong oil and gas revenues. Back in early 2022, liquid assets within the fund represented around 6.5% of GDP. Today, that figure has fallen to 1.8%. So more than 2/3 of those liquid reserves have effectively disappeared. Now, to be clear, Russia does have some resources still, country's not yet bankrupt, but one of the key financial cushions that protected the economy during the first years of the war has become dramatically smaller. And that becomes particularly important when we look at the budget situation. According to this report, Russia exceeded its entire annual budget deficit target during the first quarter of 2026, not the first half of the year, not the first 3 quarters, the very first 3 months. At the same time, oil and gas revenues fell by around 45% compared with 2025. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of this report, the growing impact of what authors describe as drone sanctions. Now, that's not an official sanctions program, it's a term used to describe the economic impact of Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. Over the last 2 years, we've seen repeated attacks on refineries, storage facilities, and energy assets. And according to this report, these attacks have significantly reduced Russia's refining capacity at various points, in some periods losses approaching 40% of refining capacity. Now, that is a very high figure, because whilst sanctions can make exports more difficult, damaged infrastructure can prevent exports entirely. And this helps explain why Russia's energy sector has become increasingly vulnerable. Now, one factor that could potentially change the outlook is what's happening in the Middle East. As we've discussed in recent videos, the war in Iran has pushed oil prices significantly higher, and the report acknowledges that higher oil prices could provide Russia with a substantial windfall. Depending on how long elevated prices persist, Russia could potentially receive tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars in additional export revenues. And that would obviously help the economy and improve the government finances and reduce some of the pressure on the budget, and even allow Russia to rebuild part of its financial reserves. However, the report makes a very important point. Higher oil prices buy time. They do not solve the underlying problems. They don't solve the labour shortages, they don't solve the banking sector stress, they don't solve productivity constraints, and they certainly don't solve what many may be the most important issue identified in the report, China. Because perhaps the most fascinating sector of this report examines how Russia's relationship with China has evolved since the war began. At the start of the conflict, many people viewed China as Russia's economic saviour. Western markets were closing, European buyers were disappearing, sanctions were increasing, and China stepped in. Trade expanded rapidly, Chinese companies supplied goods, Chinese banks facilitated transactions, Chinese buyers purchased energy exports. And on the surface, it looked like a very successful partnership. But according to the report, that partnership has become increasingly one-sided. China now accounts for around 35% of Russia's foreign trade. China has become the dominant supplier of many critical technologies and industrial components, and China is responsible for the majority of growth in imports of dual-use products that can be used for military purposes. And crucially, Russia now depends on China far more than China depends on Russia. Before the war, the European Union accounted for around 40% of Russia's exports. Today, that figure has virtually collapsed. Many of those lost customers have effectively been replaced by China, which means China has enormous leverage. Russia needs China to buy its oil, it needs China to supply technology, it needs China to facilitate trade, it needs China to provide access to critical industrial components. And when one side needs the relationship much more than the other side, the balance of power changes. The report argues that Russia has increasingly become what economists describe as a captive supplier, a seller with very little alternative. And that's a powerful position for China to be in, because it allows Beijing to demand discounts on energy purchases while simultaneously increasing Russia's dependence on Chinese imports. In effect, Russia has replaced dependence on Europe with dependence on China. The difference is that China now holds most of the cards, and that may ultimately prove to be one of the most important long-term consequences of this entire conflict. So where does all of this leave us? Well, as I mentioned at the start of today's video, the report doesn't predict collapse. It doesn't suggest that Russia is about to run out of money, and doesn't suggest that the war will end anytime soon. What it does suggest is that Russia's economic position is becoming progressively more constrained. The emergency reserves have largely been depleted, corporate debt has exploded, the banking sector is under increasing pressure, labour shortages are severe, inflation remains elevated, economic growth is slowing, and dependence on China continues to increase. None of those problems individually are fatal, but together they paint a picture of an economy that's becoming increasingly fragile. An economy that still functions, that can still finance the war, but an economy that has fewer and fewer options available to it. And that's really what the title Endgame means. Not that the game is over, but that the number of available moves is shrinking. The authors argued that for the first time since 2022, the structural foundations supporting Russia's war economy are beginning to show meaningful signs of strain. And the question now is whether those pressures continue to build over the next few years, or whether higher energy prices and other external factors provide enough relief to keep the system going. Because ultimately, wars are not won or lost solely on the battlefield. They're also won and lost in factories, banks, labour markets, and government finances. And according to this report, those are precisely the areas where Russia is now facing some of its biggest challenges. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. Really appreciate it. Helps keep me going and making as many videos as possible.